Hey everybody, welcome to the Seagull Football Network. I'm Braden. Tonight I've got one of our editors, Jack, on. We are going to be talking about the NFC South tonight, doing our deep dive for that. First up, we have one big piece of news. Wide receiver Brandon Ayuk is going to be staying in San Francisco. I know there was a lot of talk about him getting an extension or being traded. He did get a contract extension of 4 years, $120 million, which does put him at the fifth highest per year for a wide receiver. It's a really big deal. Jack, what are your thoughts on that deal for Brandon
Yeah,
Ayuk?
it's big. Like you said earlier, there was talks of him signing with a new team during free agency. That didn't happen. Then there was talks during the draft and before the draft of him being traded on draft night. And then the 49ers went with Ricky Pearsall in the first round, and people were like, okay, well, then maybe he will definitely be drafted before the season started. And as we got closer to the season, it kind of looked more and more like he wasn't going to end up being traded. I know that Washington had traded away Jahan Dotson, I think a week before Ayuk had signed that new extension, and people were like, "Oh, maybe he's going to Washington," and ultimately that didn't end up happening. But I think the signing as a whole, I think it's really good. That solidifies um, Brock Purdy with a number one and a number two in Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk for at least 4 years. I think it's safe to assume that Brock Purdy will probably sign an extension in a few years when it's up for him, as long as assuming he plays the way he's been. So that means that not only does he have those guys he'll be playing with for a while, but he also has Ricky Pearsall. And as a whole, it just kind of means that the 49ers are going to be offensively as explosive as they have been, making it to where that Super Bowl window that people say they don't have as long to win anymore, it kind of looks like it's going to stay open a little bit longer since they're able to retain those pieces that they had to help them be good.
Yeah, I agree. He's definitely a core piece of that offense, and it's really good for them to keep him there. So I'm glad they got that deal done. Let's jump into the NFC South here, starting off with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. What do you have as the strength for the Buccaneers this season?
Okay, so I have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receiving core. I think there's a lot about the Buccaneers that you could take saying is a strength or whatnot, but I think just the fact that Baker Mayfield will be throwing to a combination of Mike Evans, who just signed an extension this offseason, a 4-year extension, but also he has Trey Palmer, Chris Godwin, and then their rookie out of Washington, whose name I'm blanking on currently. Um, I think that those four, that core right there, will be enough for Baker Mayfield to be able to win games, be able to compete with some of the higher end defenses, especially being in a division who I think it's probably safe to say isn't the best when it comes to the four divisions in the NFC. So having good weapons around you that you can throw to will help tremendously as they try to make a playoff push and possibly even a Super Bowl push in the next few years.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I ended up going other side of the ball with the secondary. I really like having Jordan Whitehead and Antoine Winfield both at safety. They're both really solid players. And then you match that up with Jamel Dean, you have a really, really solid secondary. It's going to be hard for teams to throw over top of them a lot. Their cornerback two is Zion McCollum, who hasn't had a lot of impact yet, but his job is definitely easier, and he looks like he has really good potential. So I ended up going with the secondary for the Buccaneers. The weakness I went with is the interior offensive line. I think they have really, really good tackles, but they have some question marks towards the inside. Starting at center, they have first round rookie Graham Barton. He looks like he could be a solid player, but it's always hard for a rookie to come in and make an instant impact in the league. And he's joined by Ben Bredesen and Cody Mauch, who gave up 5 and 7 sacks respectively last season. So there are some question marks there. They're not the best offensive line interior group ever. So there are definitely some concerns there for keeping Baker Mayfield upright and healthy. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's good. I also went with the interior offensive line, specifically more guard. I think Barton will be okay at center. Maybe not this year, but within the next few seasons, I think he'll develop well. But guard especially, I do think those sacks that they gave up, I think you said it was like 5 and 7. That is not great. You kind of expect those numbers from tackles since they're going against the edges, and there's a lot of great edges in the league. So when you have guards giving up 5 and 7 sacks a season to defensive tackles, which usually aren't as fast or aren't as big or whatever, it is a bit of a concern. And when you have a guy like Mayfield, who is a lot more of a pocket passer, doesn't really get out of the pocket much, doesn't really run much, it will force him to kind of have to rely more on his legs, which will then force him to have to start forcing balls down the field or whatnot, which could end up being something that kills the Buccaneers season if they can't find a way to protect him and give him that time to throw. So I completely agree.
Yeah, absolutely. That brings us down to the X Factor. Who did you end up picking for the Buccaneers X Factor?
I went with Baker Mayfield. I think it's self-explanatory. He's the quarterback. Essentially, the success of the team usually lies on the back of the quarterback. If your quarterback is playing very well, normally the offense will play very well. And I think, like I said earlier with the wide receivers, I think Baker Mayfield has the weapons around him to play well. I think he has a solid running back room. So I think the only way this Buccaneers offense doesn't get going and doesn't play well and doesn't score points is if Baker Mayfield can't get it going. And if Baker Mayfield can't get it going, then there's some concern with Kyle Trask being the only other quarterback on the roster behind him. And we've seen Kyle Trask in preseason in the last few years, and he hasn't really looked like he did in college when he played for Florida. So if Baker Mayfield can't get it going, then this team might not have as good of a season as some people expect it to have. So,
yeah, I know Kyle Trask was pretty hyped up coming out of college, but it's always hard, that transition to the NFL. Not every player is quite the same.
Right.
Another example would be somebody like Tim Tebow. Obviously, he phenomenal player in college, decent in the NFL, but not anywhere near the same level. And so it's really hard to tell kind of what players are going to transition and look similar. But yeah, I agree. Baker Mayfield's going to be really, really important this season. I did go a slightly different direction. I went with Mike Evans. He is entering his 11th season. And while he's never had fewer than 1,000 yards, obviously there's the potential for injury as he's getting older. He's 31. He did also have a near career high 13 touchdowns last season, so there is that. He obviously had chemistry with Baker Mayfield. They looked really solid together. But it's going to be really a focus on him staying healthy and continuing to produce at that same level. I think it'd be a real shame for him to miss that 1,000-yard mark, especially if it was due to injury. So I think he's a really big player to keep an eye on. The success of the team kind of moves with him to a certain extent, I think. Yeah, that brings us up to the notable rookie. I ended up going with Graham Barton, the center out of Duke, who I mentioned earlier. He was taken in the first round, 26th overall. Obviously, he's going to have an instant impact role. He's currently listed as the starting center for the Buccaneers on their depth chart. And being a rookie, coming into kind of a mediocre interior group there, he's going to have to really step up and make impact on the on the offensive line, I apologize, on the offensive line, and really make some moves there. So that's who I ended up going with for my notable rookie. What did you end up picking?
I also picked Graham Barton. Like I said earlier, I think he will develop into a pretty good center. Maybe not, he may not be Jason Kelsey or whatnot, when we think about some of the good centers we've had in the league over the last few years. But I definitely think he'll develop into a guy that the Buccaneers can trust, and that whoever's playing quarterback for the Buccaneers, whether that's Baker Mayfield, the rest of his career, or somebody else, I definitely think he'll develop into that guy that the quarterback will trust to be able to protect him, be able to, snap the ball well, and just be able to be sure that he has a bit extra time in that pocket just because of how well he plays. So I think it's a good choice. It's what I chose. I think it might be the safe choice, but I think ultimately it's one of those things where, with how bad that the interior offensive line is and was last season, it's one of those things where really it's kind of the only choice you can make. So
yeah, That'll bring us up to the Buccaneers' biggest games. What did you end up picking out for them?
Okay, so I have week 2 at Detroit, week 10
Mhm.
versus San Francisco, and week 16 at Dallas. The reason I picked those 3 games, especially, is because Tampa Bay, they won the NFC South last year. They won it the year before, and I think they might have won it the year before that. I don't exactly remember because yeah, I think they did. Um, and so when you win the division, 2-3 years in a row, you're kind of expected to keep it up within the organization, the fan base, whatever. And last year, while they did win it, they won it. It kind of came down to the last game. They had the 4th seed in the playoffs. They beat the Eagles, but it didn't go much further than that. And when you look at the other divisions in the NFC, the NFC North, the NFC East, the NFC West, there's pretty much a lock on who's going to win it, or a pretty good idea on who's going to win it. You have San Francisco for the West, probably Detroit for the North, and then probably Detroit or Philadelphia for the East. I would say probably Detroit if I had to pick between those two. And so when you're playing the 3 teams that is a very high possibility that they will win the division and be one of those top 4 teams in going into the playoffs, you want to be able to beat at least 1 or 2 of those, so that way you can hopefully get a better seeding going in and not have to face as tough of an opponent when you end up playing your playoff game.
Yeah, actually, you ended up picking 2 of the 3 games that I picked out as well. I also went with week 2 at Detroit and week 10 versus San Francisco. I also tossed in week 18 versus New Orleans. I think those 2 teams have a pretty solid chance of making a playoff berth. And I think that game coming right at the end of the season could be, the game that gets the Buccaneers the division title. Or if they lose, it could mean that it costs them the playoffs. So I think that's also a really big game to keep an eye on for the Buccaneers. All right, that wraps up the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and brings us down to the New Orleans Saints. Starting off with the biggest strength, I ended up picking their defense. The Saints were ranked 4th in takeaways last season. They had 29 total, and they also allowed the 9th least passing yards in the NFL. And the defense is looking to try to do the same again this year. Led by Cam Jordan, Demario Davis, Marshawn Lattimore, and Tyrann Mathieu. They're a very solid defense. They're going to look to limit their opponents as much as possible. And a really underrated move that they made this season that I think helps bolster their defense was the signing of Willie Gay from the Chiefs. He's been a really solid player, obviously has championship experience. And so I think that's a really good addition as well. And I think the defense is going to be potent against offenses this season. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I kind of narrowed it down to a specific unit on the defense, and I went with the defensive line. They have Cameron
Mhm.
Jordan. They have Chase Young, who some people are kind of labeling him as a bust. I've seen it a little bit online. I don't think he is. I will agree that he's not as good as he was the first 2 years of his career when he was in Washington. But I definitely still think he's good enough. He's still a good enough player to have some kind of impact. You got Brian Brzee. He was a rookie in 2023. He's got a lot of potential, a lot of upside. And so I think that as a whole, I think that the defensive line will be good this year. I think they're gonna get a lot of pressure, and it'll make the job of the rest of the defense, the linebackers, the DBs, it'll make their job easier if you have a good pass rush who's able to get to the quarterback and fluster the quarterback and get the quarterback to maybe force a ball in there or overthrow or overcompensate or undercompensate for a pass because he's more concerned with trying not to take a sack. And that overall will help the defense as a whole play better and not make as many mistakes. So I definitely do agree the defense is going to be good, but I kind of narrowed it down to specifically the defensive line.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm a really big fan of Lattimore and Matthew up in the secondary. But yeah, that defensive line is going to be really, really solid. They've got good linebackers as well. So yeah, I'm really excited to see what their defense and that defensive line end up doing this season. What did you end up picking out for the Saints' weakness?
For my weakness, I chose the quarterback room. They have Derek Carr. He's going to be the starter. I've never been big on Derek Carr even when he played for the Raiders. He's kind of just a mediocre guy. He was better when he was younger, but as he's gotten older, he just kind of hasn't been it. He kind of really hasn't been the guy who's been able to help his team win games and take over games and really put the team on his back to help win. And then, behind him, you have Jake Haener, Tyson Hill, and Spencer Rattler. Obviously, Spencer Rattler is a rookie this year. I believe he was taken in the 4th or 5th round. I think Jake Haener was taken last year, the year before. And then obviously you have Tyson Hill. Everybody knows Tyson Hill. He plays tight end, quarterback. He's kind of does everything for the Saints. But they don't really have that guy under center taking the snaps who can kind of change the game. And I feel like when you're playing a sport like football, but especially professionally, not having a good quarterback can be the difference between an elite team and a good team. And I think the Saints, realistically, with how good their defense is and how good of offensive weapons that they have, they're really one quarterback away, I think, from being able to be a top tier team, or at least a good enough to win the NFC South on a regular basis. Spencer Rattler might be that guy for them in the future, but I don't see him starting this year unless an injury happens or Derek Carr is just playing bad and he just happens to somehow get put in a game. So I think the quarterback position is the weakness for this team, and I think we will see a lot of games that the Saints lose because of lackluster quarterback play, and that will really shape this team as a whole in their record.
Yeah, I disagree a little bit with the criticism of Derek Carr personally. I think he was a really, really solid quarterback a couple years ago. He had really good numbers, was putting up good touchdowns, low interception numbers. He's definitely taken a step back the last couple seasons, specifically kind of 2, maybe 3. But I did go kind of a similar direction. I chose the Saints passing game. With the exception of Chris Olave and Alvin Kamara, there's not really anybody super impressive in their receiver room. Rashid Shaheed is fine. Foster Moreau is fine. But they aren't really great. And with that step back that Derek Carr's taken, if he doesn't take another step forward, we may see some really lackluster play from the receivers as well. So that's what I ended up going with, kind of the similar vein as what you picked. So there's at least a little bit of agreement there. That'll bring us up to the X Factor. Do you want to tell us who you picked out for the Saints?
I did. I will. This might be an interesting pick. I picked Alvin Kamara as the X Factor for the Saints. I'm not really high on the team as a whole. I think they have a good defense. They have good playmakers on offense like Olave, like Kamara. But other than that, I'm not really sure that this team is that great. I don't know if they'll be able to really compete with a lot of teams. I personally don't have them winning the division. But I think that Kamara is that player who he's been on the Saints for a while. Everybody knows who he is, and he's always been reliable while he's been there whenever he has been healthy. And even though the last 2 or 3 years he hasn't been, that elite running back like he has been in the past, I think he definitely still shows flashes and definitely can still take over a game when he does have a good game, when he does get involved in the passing game. And so I feel like him being he's the X factor, because if he has a good game, the offense will play well, they'll have success. And if he's not having that great of a game, I feel like the offense will take a little bit of a step back, and it'll be a lot more on the defense, on having to stop the opposing offense in order to stay in games and in order to win games.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I obviously mentioned him as one of the players I do like in the passing game. The other one I mentioned is who I chose for my X Factor, Chris Olave. He's definitely been impressive. He's entering his 3rd season in the league. But if the Saints are going to be contenders, he's really going to have to step up, especially when it comes to getting into the end zone. He only has 9 touchdowns so far through his 2 seasons. It was 4 and 5. I don't remember what order. But he's really going to have to make more of an impact if they want to be able to have that success that they're looking for. Obviously, Kamara will as well. But I'm really looking for Olave as one of the starting receivers to take another step, improve a little bit, and really work on that chemistry with his quarterbacks so that he can get more yards, get them some wins, and get in the end zone. So that's who I chose is Chris Olave. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, Olave was going to be my second choice. I kind of thought the two that we would pick would be Kamara and Olave, and didn't really want to have the same pick. But what I will add onto that is Olave definitely is a good player. He's probably the best receiver on the team, just impact wise over the last few years. And I do agree. I think as long as he plays well, he will be a game changer on how well this team does, how well the offense plays throughout the season, and he will be a factor on if they can make it to the playoffs or not. So I definitely agree with everything that you say. I think he's a good player, and I think he will be a lot of the Saints' success will be based on how well he plays.
Yeah, for sure. It's especially tough for the Saints when they come off of seasons having Michael Thomas leading the way at receiver. He had success consistently across the board until he started getting injured. Now he's not even on the team. So it's just really difficult, I think, to look at Olave. And he has all the potential. He just hasn't quite put it all together yet. But I think there's a good chance that this is the season that he puts it all together and really succeeds out on the field. So that's why I ended up going with Olave. That'll bring us up to the notable rookie. I ended up going with Talisa Fuaga. He was tackle out of Oregon, picked 14th overall. Just like Graham Barton with the Buccaneers, he looks like he's going to be starting week 1 on the offensive line. So he has an instant impact opportunity. One thing I noted is he is 6'6" and 324 pounds. So he is an absolute beast at tackle. I look forward to seeing what he can do mauling some edge rushers and protecting Derek Carr. I think he's going to be a really exciting player to watch. What did you end up going with?
I went the other side of the ball. I went with one of my favorite players in the draft, Kool-Aid McKinstry, cornerback out of Alabama, taken round 2, pick 41. And we talked about the defense already. We talked about the secondary, or you talked about the secondary specifically. But I think Kool-Aid was definitely one of the best corners in the draft. He fell to the second round when a lot of people thought he would have been taken in the first. I thought he should have been taken in the first personally. But when you look at, the cornerback class, you had, Quinion Mitchell, Cooper DeJean, Nate Wiggins, Kool-Aid McKinstry, Terrion Arnold. Those are kind of like the top 5 guys. I felt like Kool-Aid was in the top 2 or 3 when it came to corners, and I think I don't know exactly how the depth chart is shaped out so far. He might not even be starting come week 1. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I think when he does get a chance to get in the game and get a chance to play, I think he will never be taken out. I think he'll kind of win that starting job slowly. I think he's the next great cornerback for the Saints at least. And I think he brings a lot of upside to a defense that's already pretty good, especially with a secondary that has Tyrann Mathieu and guys who have proven that they can play well. And I think when you have a young guy coming in to a group of guys that has veteran players who have played well, it will not only help him develop well, but it'll help him play better. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Kool-Aid McKinstry comes out and plays better than some of the other cornerbacks taken before him in the draft, just because of the scheme he's in and how good of the defense he will be playing on.
Yeah, I'm consistently impressed with the Saints secondary and especially their corners. They seem to always have one of the best groups of corners. And I definitely agree. I think the drafting of McKinstry is definitely going to help with that. Give them even more years into the future of having some of the best corners and one of the better defenses in the league. So yeah, I completely agree. I think that's a really, really good pick. That'll bring us up to the Saints' biggest games. I ended up picking 3 games at the very end of their season that I think are going to be really, really tough, kind of back to back to back. The first one is Week 16 at Green Bay. Obviously, Week 16, that's a later game. It's going to be cold up in Green Bay, so that gives the Packers a really big advantage, especially for the Saints coming out of New Orleans, where it does not get that cold. It's going to be an interesting game to see how the Saints deal with that. Week 17, they host Las Vegas. This is back up against the former team of Derek Carr. That'll be an interesting one to see how he does. And then lastly is Week 18 at Tampa Bay. Like I mentioned before, this could have big playoff implications. It could be this game could fully rearrange the divisional rankings depending on how it ends. So I think those three games there at the end of their season are really big ones to keep an eye on. What are your thoughts, and what did you end up picking out?
Yeah, I would agree. Obviously, you want to finish your season as strongly as you start your season. You don't really want to, do. I'm going to use Jacksonville as an example. You don't want to do what Jacksonville did last season when you start 8-3. You have all the hype going in, and then you kind of fall apart towards the end of the year and finish 9-8, winning only winning only one game and losing five. You don't really want to kind of do that, especially when you are in a division like the NFC South that kind of is up for grabs by any of the teams in the division. And so I definitely agree. Those final games towards the end will definitely be big. They'll definitely be kind of prove-it games towards the end of the season of how badly do you want this? Do you want to be able to make the playoffs, be able to make a push for the division if it hasn't been won by then? So I definitely agree. I kind of took a little bit of a different route. I picked 3 games towards the beginning of the season. They're pretty close to each other. I got week 2 at Dallas, week 3 versus Philly, and then week 5 at Kansas City. And I kind of picked this for the same reason of what I was saying about how you want to finish the season the way you start the season. These are going to be 3 tough games that they're playing almost back to back to back. I think they play Atlanta week 4 in between the Philly and Kansas City game. But these are all games where Philly and Dallas, either one of them could win their division, and then obviously Kansas City will probably win theirs. This is 3 of the best teams in the league. And so when you're the Saints in a division that's up for grabs and you want to kind of try to prove to not only your division but the league that you are capable of competing with anybody and capable of making it to the playoffs, you need to be able to go toe-to-toe with some of these better teams, some of the tougher opponents that you're going to face. And which is why I picked these 3, because I feel like these are definitely winnable games because they're earlier in the season, and usually teams don't really come to their form until mid to late season when they really show what they're made of and really able to go all 4 quarters without really getting tired or looking confused or whatever. So I definitely could see win one of these games. But I definitely do think these are games that they're going to need to play well in at least, even if they lose all 3 of them or 2 of them or whatnot, if they want to be able to make a push, because if they can play well in these games and keep playing that well throughout the season, there's definitely a lot of games they will be able to win just because of how well they are playing.
Yeah, absolutely. That'll wrap up the New Orleans Saints and bring us up to the Atlanta Falcons. Let's talk about strength. Funnily enough, I kind of went a similar pattern with the Falcons as I have the previous 2 teams, and I went with the secondary. The Falcons secondary that already had Jesse Bates and A.J. Terrell leading the way was upgraded even further with the addition of Justin Simmons. 7th-year corner Mike Hughes and 3rd-year nickelback D. Alford should have an easier time defending the pass with the added help. They're good players, not great, but with the added help up top, I think they're going to be a perfectly solid duo of additional corners. What are your thoughts, and what did you pick out for the Falcons' strength?
Yeah, I agree. Their corners are going to be good. The secondary as a whole will be good. They just extended A.J. Terrell, which has played fairly well, I think, in my opinion. He's definitely a good corner for them. They also just signed Justin Simmons, who played in Denver for most of his career. I know he doesn't play corner. He plays safety, but they're pretty much one and the same. Well, not one and the same, but they work together a lot. And so I do agree with you. Their secondary is going to be good. And they definitely will take over some games. I went on more of the offensive side of the ball. I kind of picked a specific player and that was Bijan Robinson. And I know what you might be thinking. Why did you not pick him as X Factor? It was between him and one other player for X Factor. We'll get into that later. But I didn't pick him as X Factor because I think the run game is and will be the strongest part of this team this season. Bijan Robinson had a phenomenal rookie season last year. He was I know when Atlanta took him at 8, some people were like, "Oh, why would you take a running back? At 8, first round." But he definitely didn't disappoint. He came out there, and he looked like he had been playing running back in the NFL for 2, 3, 4 seasons. It never once looked like he was confused or couldn't keep up. He kind of just got the ball and did what Bijan Robinson does. So the running game will definitely be, I think, the biggest strength offensively. And it'll help Atlanta win games and help Kirk Cousins and the rest of this offense move down the field as long as they can rely on that run game and as long as Bijan Robinson stays healthy.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I wasn't the biggest fan of Bijan Robinson personally last season. Obviously, he was a rookie. There's a lot more that he has the potential to do, and he definitely had some impressive moments. But overall, his numbers I didn't think were super impressive. I think he finished with around 970 yards and 4 touchdowns, I think. So yeah, I think he definitely has the opportunity to be a strength, but he's going to have to do a little bit more, I think, to really get to that point. As for the weakness for the Atlanta Falcons, I ended up picking the receivers. I think the addition of Kirk Cousins is definitely one that should help the team overall, and especially make the receivers look a little bit better than maybe they did in the past. But the receiver room doesn't really look that amazing. Drake London, over his 2 seasons, only has 1,771 yards and 6 touchdowns. Again, the offense he was on was abysmal. They were terrible. Play calling, the quarterback play, none of that was any good. So that might not all reflect 100% on him. But then you toss in Darnell Mooney and Ray McLeod, and it's still just not all that impressive. Kyle Pitts has been underwhelming since his rookie season. I know he continually gets hyped up every offseason, but he hasn't backed that up the last 2 years. So I have some concerns about the receiver room for the Atlanta Falcons. And those players, yeah, I'm just not very impressed overall. And I hope that Kirk Cousins will be able to make something work. Hopefully the new play calling will help as well. What are your thoughts, and what did you pick out for their weakness?
I also went wide receiving core. I'd agree. They don't really have a true number one receiver. I mean, Drake London is playing the number one, but they don't really have that go-to guy who, can take over a game with his presence. I do want to kind of bounce back a little bit on the Kyle Pitts thing. He has been underwhelming. I will admit that. But some of that was more Arthur Smith and less Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts coming into the 2021 draft was coming in as a receiving tight end, meant to play more receiver than he was anything else. And while he did do that quite a bit in the 3 years that he has played, Arthur Smith kind of used him more as a blocking tight end or a guy to just have him run down the field, but never really had his quarterbacks look his way. I think he will play better this year just with having the new coach, the new coaching regime, and a new quarterback back there. So I wouldn't necessarily say that Kyle Pitts himself hasn't lived up to potential. Well, yes, he hasn't. He's played lackluster. I think a lot of that has been more of the scheme that he's been playing in and the way he was kind of set up. I feel like he wasn't set up for a lot of success. But I think with the rest of the receiving core, I agree. They have Darnell Mooney. I think he's okay. He's not a great wide receiver. He's not bad. He can run routes. He can catch the football. But he's not going to be that game changer for Atlanta. Which is why I picked the run game or Bijan Robinson, especially for the strength, because I feel like without the run game, this offense isn't really going to be able to get going. So yeah, I agree. Wide receiving core is definitely probably the biggest weakness on this team.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I also don't necessarily agree that Arthur Smith is to blame for Kyle Pitts not playing well. Because if you look at his history, especially with the Titans, he used tight ends really, really well as their offensive coordinator. You've got people like Delaney Walker, Jonnu Smith, who all had really, really great seasons under Arthur Smith. And I think Kyle Pitts had some injury struggle in there as well. So part of that could be applied to that. But I also wouldn't blame Arthur Smith personally.
Right. I'm not. I'm not blaming it all on Arthur Smith. I do think some of it is on Kyle Pitts. He hasn't, gotten open. I would say because obviously when you throw the ball, when you're throwing the ball, you want to throw it to somebody who's open and somebody who you trust enough to come down with that catch. So some of it is on Kyle Pitts. I just think that not all of his underwhelmingness, if you want to say, is purely based on him. I know I have watched some Falcons games, some of their film or whatnot, where he had been open or he had one on a route and the quarterback didn't even look his way. I don't know if that's more of a quarterback problem or if the play that they picked was designed to go to a specific player or not. I just do know that I have seen a few times where I've watched some of the games or watched some of the film, and he would just kind of be running out there, and they wouldn't even look his way, which is kind of why I was saying that a little bit. It definitely goes hand in hand. I wouldn't necessarily blame his production on him or the coaching, but I definitely do think some of it is on the coaching, along with some of it being on.
Yeah, that's fair. That'll bring us up to the X factor for the Falcons. I ended up picking quarterback Kirk Cousins. I think he really needs to prove that he's worth the investment the Falcons made in him this season. His $180 million deal that he signed with them comes off on the heels, no pun intended, of an Achilles tear that he suffered last season, cut his season short. So he's really going to have to prove that he can get back into the game, go back to being that top 15, top 10, arguably, quarterback that he was the last couple seasons. And obviously, he doesn't really have somebody like Justin Jefferson, so he's also going to have to prove that he can work with what the Falcons have. So I think a lot of the season and the offensive success is going to depend on Kirk Cousins. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I didn't pick Kirk Cousins. I actually did go with Kyle Pitts. And the reason I went with Kyle Pitts is he's going into his fourth year. Like you said, he's kind of had, he's been lackluster up to this point. And I feel like with a new coaching staff, a new quarterback, he is, I know we've said it every year, he's primed for a breakout year. And I as much as it hurts me to say as a Florida fan, as a big Kyle Pitts fan, I do think if he doesn't perform great this year, if he's not that Kyle Pitts that came into the 2021 draft, it's very possible that maybe he's not on Atlanta next year or the year after. He is coming up. This is his final year on his rookie contract. He hasn't signed anything else. So I definitely do think that there's a lot weighing on his success this year if he wants to stay in Atlanta. And I think if he can get evolved and if he can become that player he was in college, I think Atlanta's offense will be really good, even with the wide receivers they have around them, because you'll have a lot of defenses kind of now scheming to be sure Kyle Pitts isn't open, which would then scheme other receivers open. But if Kyle Pitts plays like he has the last 2 or 3 years, where he hasn't really been that guy that is open enough to get the ball or isn't really playing the way he did in college, then I very well could see this offense not being able to get open just because they don't have anybody to get the ball to.
Yeah, that's fair. It is worth noting in April of this year, they did pick up his fifth-year option. So he will be at least with Atlanta through the 2025 season, unless he ends up getting traded. But it is still sort of a contract year this year and next year. So there's a chance that he does take a step forward. I know a lot of players do in their contract years. They tend to show out. And I'm really hopeful that he can kind of get back to that rookie season level of production as well. He was a really fun player to watch. A little bit disappointing the last 2 years, but we'll see where he ends up this season. All right, that'll bring us up to the notable rookie. Who did you end up picking out for the Atlanta Falcons?
Right, so I picked out their second round pick at pick 35 out of Clemson, defensive tackle Rook Orhoro. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I am dyslexic, so bear with me. But I think he will be a good defensive tackle. I'm not the biggest fan of the defensive tackles that they have on this team, or really the defensive line as a whole. I think they're good enough. I think they're serviceable. They'll definitely be able to apply pressure. But having a young guy like Rook, whether he starts this year and takes all the snaps or is playing in a more rotational role, I think he will be able to come in and he'll be able to apply that pressure and be able to disrupt the passing game enough to maybe give the rest of this defense the upper hand and hopefully help them win a few games just because of that presence that he brings to the defensive line.
Yeah, absolutely. I also ended up going with Rook Orororo. It was funny. I was watching the first preseason game he was in, and one of the announcers kept saying his name Ororo, and the other one was like, "Hey, you're missing one of the syllables in there." He's got a really hard name to pronounce. I had to Google it to figure it out. But yeah, I also picked Rook Orororo out of Clemson. Fun fact about Rook, he was born in Lagos, Nigeria, and ended up moving to Michigan when he was 9 years old. I thought he was really impressive in the preseason. I don't agree that the Falcons' defensive tackles are bad. I really like Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata. They're currently listed as the starters with Rook backing them up. I think they're going to be really good players for him to sit behind and learn. And with Grady Jarrett being the age that he is, he'll probably end up rotating with Rook quite a bit this season. But I totally agree. I think he's going to be a really impactful rookie this season.
I do want to say I don't think they're going to be bad. I just don't think because of age that they'll be, a top tier defensive line or defensive tackles. I definitely do think they're going to be good. I originally was going to pick them for my weakness, and then I went through their roster and saw Grady Jarrett, and I was like, I can't. Grady Jarrett he's still a good player even with that age. I just think sometimes when it comes to age, players do tend to take a little bit of a step back. I mean, not everybody. We saw Aaron Donald was elite his entire career, but I do think every now, we see it a lot with players, especially on the defensive side of the ball or the defensive line, where they kind of get older and they start to slow down. They can't really get to where they were. And so, yeah, like I said, I don't think they're bad. I just don't think they will play up to the potential that they have, or that they can play, or that they have played in the past because of age.
Yeah, that makes sense. That'll bring us up to the biggest games for the Atlanta Falcons. I ended up going kind of with 6. We'll jump into it. So I started off with week 1, hosting Pittsburgh. Obviously, they have a really solid defense. It's going to be a good challenge for this new look offense led by Kirk Cousins. We'll kind of get a really good test of how he's going to look the rest of the season. Same thing with week 2 at Philadelphia. And then they play Kansas City in week 3, which is obviously a really big game coming up against the reigning champs 2 times running. And then the next 3 games, weeks 4 through 6, are all divisional games up against the Panthers, the Buccaneers, and the Saints. So that's a really tough, I think, stretch of 6 games that I think is going to really kind of show us what the Falcons are made of, kind of give us a look forward into how the rest of their season's going to go. And so I ended up picking those games there. What did you end up picking out for the Falcons' biggest games?
Yeah, so I also have week 1 versus Pittsburgh. I picked it mainly just because, like I said earlier, I feel like the NFC South is kind of up for grabs. I feel like any team can win it, with maybe the exception of the Panthers. We'll kind of get into that in a little while. But I also think the Panthers could possibly win. It just depends on how the rest of this goes. But as you and Ben talked about a few weeks back with the AFC North, that division is super competitive, not only within itself, but they just play really competitive no matter who they play. And the defense is great, so I definitely do agree. It'll be a kind of show what you got game for Kirk Cousins and all of the Atlanta offense, kind of to prove that they will be good and that they can compete not only with the other 3 teams in the division, but that they can compete with any team that they play moving forward. I only had one other game, and it was luckily a game that you did not pick, and that was Week 14 at Minnesota. And I picked this game. It's kind of self-explanatory. Kirk Cousins' first game back in Minnesota since he's left there. Obviously, it's not where he started his career, but it's where he played at most recently. You could call it a revenge game if you wanted to. I don't think there was any hard feelings between Minnesota and Cousins when Cousins left. Cousins kind of knew where they were going to go. That he knew they were going to draft a rookie quarterback, and kind of just decided it was better to leave. But it's still, a place that he spent the last 4 or 5 years, I believe, playing. And it'll be one of those games that'll really kind of show, because it's late in the season, just really what Atlanta's made of, what Kirk Cousins is made of, being back at the stadium he's played at most recently for the last few seasons of his career. And it'll really just kind of show if this team can still play consistently at the later part of the season as they are able to at the beginning of the season.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a revenge game. We like the drama, so we're going to call it a revenge game. All right, that'll wrap up the Atlanta Falcons. Let's move on to the last team in the NFC South, the Carolina Panthers. What did you pick out as the Panthers' biggest strength?
Right. So, the Panthers' biggest strength I chose, it was between two. I ended up kind of settling on the cornerbacks. I know they only really have like one notable guy back there, being J.C. Horn. They have a few other guys back there who are good, not great, but they definitely can make plays. I struggled to pick a bigger strength because the Panthers aren't a great team, and while they have made improvements, they've also lost guys like Brian Burns and a few of the good playmakers they had, Frankie Louvu, and a few of those other guys. So I kind of went with the cornerback because I don't really think the wide receivers are their biggest strength. Not yet, at least, which was the only other position I was thinking about picking. But I do think that their cornerbacks are good enough that they'll be able to disrupt the passing game. They'll be able to make plays here and there, maybe keep the Panthers in a few that maybe they shouldn't be kept in just because their corners have a great game or whatnot.
Yeah, I agree. I went a little bit more general with the whole defense. Obviously they traded away Brian Burns this season, who I think was arguably the best defensive player on their team, maybe even the best player on the Panthers. But I think the combination still of like Shai Tuttle, Derek Brown, Jadeveon Clowney, who they signed, J.C. Horn, Jordan Fuller, and Josie Jewell makes for still a solid defense overall. They're by no means like a top half defense, I don't think, but they're a good defense. I think it's going to be one of the better parts of their team. And there are definitely still some weak points to the defense, but you can probably mostly cover those up with the talent from some of the other players. So yeah, I definitely do agree. I would say J.C. Horn is probably the best remaining defensive player, so I totally agree with you there as well. That brings us up to the biggest weakness for the Panthers. I ended up picking their offensive firepower. I think bringing in Deontay Johnson was a good move, as long as he's actually committed to playing for the team. Obviously, we saw some issues in Pittsburgh. There was that play where he kind of watched a fumble recovery run right past him and didn't do anything to stop it. But I don't know that adding him is going to be enough, even if he is in a better place than in Pittsburgh. Adam Thielen's 34, also entering his 11th season, like Mike Evans. Jonathan Mingo is fine as a wide receiver. Chuba Hubbard's fine. Tommy Trimble's fine. I just don't really like a lot of the offensive playmakers that they have a ton. I think they're just about middle of the pack for each player. So I think their offense is going to be probably their biggest weakness overall. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree and disagree. I definitely think their offense will not be as good as their defense will be. And I don't think their defense will be great. I do think they have players on there that'll help their offense make plays and that'll shine every now and then. We'll get into that in a little while with some of the picks I have. But I would agree. I didn't pick the playmakers though. I picked the offensive line as a whole. The offensive line just wasn't good last year. They let up 65 sacks. Um, that's a lot of sacks, especially when you have a rookie quarterback back there who is on a team that already isn't great, trying to do the best he can with what he has. You don't want an offensive line who's going to allow him to be on the ground as much as he was. And I think that some of why Bryce Young played as bad as he did last year, I think a little bit of it as well is I just don't think he was ready to be starting in the NFL, and he was. But I do think a lot of it was just how bad the offensive line played. And I think a lot of the success for the offense for some of these players, for how well some of these receivers play, will be based on if the offensive line can give Bryce Young enough time to throw the ball downfield more than just 2 or 3 yard checkdowns because he doesn't have anywhere else to go with it.
Yeah, that's fair. I almost went with the offensive line, but I like some of the improvements that they made this offseason. Obviously, it still might not be enough, but I'm kind of hopeful that that's not going to be their biggest weakness, and that's why I didn't end up picking it.
Right, and they definitely made improvements, like I said, but it's one of those things where when I'm kind of thinking about a weakness moving forward, we haven't seen all of those offensive players play together as one unit. The offensive line could be a lot better this year than it was last year, but because we've seen some of those guys in preseason, and we've seen them in together, but we haven't seen them in together for a full 4 quarters for 17 games, and so it's one of those things where how well will they be able to play when it gets down to the later parts of the season or later parts of the game when they may be running a 15 to 20 play drive, and it's kind of why I picked them, because they weren't great last year, and because we don't really know for certain if they will be great this year. I couldn't really not pick them as their weakness. You know what I mean?
For sure. That'll bring us up to the Panthers X Factor. Who did you pick out for the Carolina Panthers?
Right. So I picked quarterback Bryce Young. I do think he will be a good quarterback for the Panthers as long as he can develop and gets the help that he needs. I don't think he should have started last year. I also don't think he should have been taken number 1 overall in the 2023 draft. This is something I was standing on way before that draft even happened. I thought he just wasn't ready for the NFL. But I'm not an NFL scout, so it is what it is. But I think a lot of the Panthers' success this season, and after moving forward next season, the season after, will be based on how well Bryce Young can play. Because like we said, they did make improvements to the offensive line. They did, get him a few new receivers. And so if he's able to play well, he's able to have time to throw and be able to play like the quarterback that he was at Alabama in college, then I think this Panthers offense and team will be good. Well, not good, but they'll be fine moving forwards. And I think they will get to the point where they'll be able to, maybe start making a push for the division as they get, through the years, through the seasons, as they start addressing more of these problems they have. But if we get more of the Bryce Young that we had last season, more of the Bryce Young who just kind of looks like he doesn't really know what's going on, kind of looks like he is constantly confused, constantly flustered, and just kind of throwing the ball wherever just so he can, get the ball out of his hands so he's not taking a sack. If we get that Bryce Young again, then I think this team will probably finish as one of the worst teams in the league again, just because they already don't have many playmakers on the offense, and the defense, like we said, isn't great. They're not going to be able to do everything on their own. So we're definitely going to need to see major improvement from Bryce Young moving forward, especially this season, if they want to be able to start making the changes that they need to make to be a good program and be able to compete for a division and the playoffs down the road.
Yeah, I agree. I also picked Bryce Young. I think, yeah, he really needs to take a step forward from what we saw last season. His stats: 2,877 yards, 11 touchdowns, 10 ints. Those are, in fact, pretty rookie-looking numbers. In all fairness, he was a rookie. I agree. I don't think he should have started last season. As I've said probably 1,000 times on this podcast at this point, I'm not a fan of rookie quarterbacks starting week one. I would have liked to have seen more development out of him. Obviously, there's also concerns about his size. He's a little bit of a smaller frame, shorter guy. But I don't think that that's really what's holding him back. I think a lot of it's mental, catching up to the NFL speed. And I think he has the potential to do really, really well. But we're going to need to see some of that development, some of that production this season. Otherwise, I agree. I think the Panthers are going to be in for a really rough, long season that might result in another first or second overall pick. So I agree with you there, 100%. That brings us up to the notable rookie. I ended up picking wide receiver Xavier Legette out of South Carolina. He ended up being picked first round, 32nd over. I think if he develops correctly, he could end up being a game changer for the Panthers. I mentioned Adam Thielen's age earlier. That's a concern. Deontay Johnson's kind of like attitude and commitment could be a concern. And so I think there's definitely an opportunity for Legette to come in and make an impact really, really early. And at 6'1", 221 pounds, he's got good size. He's got really good speed as well. So I think he's going to develop into an awesome weapon for Bryce Young to be able to utilize. What did you end up picking out for their rookie?
Yeah, I also picked Xavier Legette. Um, I think it's less of a if he can develop and more of a when he develops. And when I say that, I'm not saying necessarily he'll be that game changing wide receiver, but I think at some point this season he will solidify himself as the go to target. I like we said, Adam Thielen is in his 30s. He's been in the league for a long time. Besides him, they have Deontay Johnson, who on Pittsburgh, like we said, just kind of sometimes seemed like he didn't want to be playing. And then they have Jonathan Mingo, who's young. He showed promise, but he hasn't really, had that breakout game yet. And Xavier Legette has all the potential to be that number one receiver. He's 6'1". There's a few receivers that are bigger than him, but he's still 6'1", 221 pounds. That's stereotypically, a number one receiver type of height and weight. But the thing that impressed me the most is his speed. He ran a 4.39 at the combine for the 40-yard dash. That's fast. That's incredible. And I think that right there is what's going to solidify him being that go-to target, because I think he's going to be so fast that he's going to be able to get open sooner. Maybe if it's on streaks or deep posts where he's just gonna be able to make a cut and just be there and be able to be open enough to where Young can throw the ball to him, whether he has pressure in his face or not, and get the ball to him and be able to move it downfield. I think that while he is a rookie and he does still have development to do, I think he will solidify himself as the go-to target this season and maybe even have break the 1,000-yard mark. I think it's very possible. That'll just mainly depend more on Bryce Young and how well he plays. But I could see Legette coming out and being a big impact for the Panthers and their offense this season, and they winning games or being more competitive in games because of how well Legette plays.
Yeah, for sure. That'll bring us up to the biggest games for the Carolina Panthers. What did you end up picking out for them?
Right. So I picked 3 games. We have week 5 at Chicago. It's an early week. It's an early in the season game, so it's not going to be, hopefully it's not going to be too cold. It'll probably be, mid to in September, early October by then. I'm not exactly sure what date they're playing in Chicago. After that, I have week 7 in Washington, and then I got week 16 versus Arizona. And the reason I picked these 3 games, while they're not They may not be super tough games. Washington and Chicago will probably be tougher games, especially because they're away games, but just also because of the improvement they've had from last year to this year. But I picked these three teams because, like the Panthers, they have a lot of improvement to do, or did do a lot of improvement over the off season. And I think it's going to be one of those things. We have Chicago. Caleb Williams will be starting at quarterback, the number one overall pick, and then Bryce Young, the number one overall pick of the 2023 draft. And I think it'll be one of those things where we'll really be able to see how improved Carolina is, if at all, playing against teams that either are very improved or that have improving to do, like Arizona, that are out there to prove something, but also people aren't really expecting to go super far in the playoffs, or maybe not even win the division, but still make the playoffs and still show people that they're able to compete with other teams.
Yeah, that makes sense. I also have Week 5 at Chicago, mostly for that first round or first overall pick versus first overall pick dynamic. I think that's going to be really exciting to see, especially when Caleb Williams was a pick traded to the Bears by the Panthers. We might see a little bit of regret from the Panthers in not holding on to that and waiting another season to get their quarterback. And then the other game I picked is Week 1 at New Orleans. Obviously, it's a divisional game, and we talked about how good New Orleans' defense is, so it's going to be a really good test for the Panthers, and we'll be able to, I think, see what kind of improvement Bryce Young has made from last year, if any. But yeah, I agree with your picks as well for those big games there. All right, that wraps up not only our NFC South deep dive, but also our entire series of deep dives. That's all 8 divisions that we've covered. The season starts next week, this Thursday. It'll be the Baltimore Ravens and Kansas City Chiefs. So we're looking forward to that game. Thank you guys all for watching. We're super excited to keep doing more videos. If you have any thoughts, leave a comment down below, give us a like, subscribe if you're not already, and we will see you guys with our next video.